Hi, this is Carson with Zer0es. Today we have a very special guest, Matt Pottinger. Matt is presently a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and is chairman of the China program at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Prior to that, Matt was the Deputy National Security Advisor in the Trump administration and was one of the most influential people in the administration on China policy and even representing the administration overseas with our allies. So Matt, fantastic to have you here. Thank you so much.
Carson, it's great. Thanks for having me.
What I'd love to talk about is obviously what everybody, thinks about, and it's such a broad topic, but really the future of China's relationship with the world. We also on Zer0es come at it from a very capital market specific perspective. And again, these are really broad topics, but part and parcel of this is understanding what have been, what policy blind spots have we had historically? What do we still have now in terms of policy blind spots and also limitations? And again, that's a very big topic. But if we could start, you have an interesting understanding of China's posture to the U.S. and to the West historically. For a lot of people, it seems like they just in the past few years got the memo that China might have had less than pure intentions toward the U.S. But I think you believe it's been several decades in the making. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, when, what point China really started viewing the U.S. as a force with which it has to compete.
No, well, it's a good way to frame it. I mean, we've had policy blind spots is a kind way to put it, because we've actually had a major historic strategic blunder in underestimating the nature of the Chinese system and the will of the ruling Chinese Communist Party to hang on to that system and hang on to their power at any cost. So if you go back 30 years to the end of the Cold War ended 30 years ago this month. It's when the Soviet Union really dissolved. The Chinese Communist Party obviously was badly shaken by that event. They'd been shaken by a couple of other events that were recounted very well in Rush Doshi's book, The Long Game, which came out earlier this year, where he had gone back and actually read what Chinese officials were saying 30 years ago based on memoirs and documents that hadn't been translated previously. What's clear now is that the Communist Party was rattled by, obviously, the 1989 student protests that preceded the collapse of the Iron Curtain, right? It was the spring of 1989 that Chinese demonstrators were gunned down in and around Tiananmen Square by the hundreds. And then, of course, in early 91, the United States led a military coalition to whip Saddam Hussein's forces that had invaded Kuwait. And it was a very lopsided victory. That was a shock from a military standpoint for Chinese leaders. And then, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had given birth really to the Chinese Communist Party, and yet it collapsed without much more than a whimper. And so the party then decided that the United States would, from then on, be regarded as the primary external adversary of China, whereas for the 10 years up to that point, the United States and China had actually worked together, going back more than 10 years, really, to sort of offset Soviet power. This was Nixon and Kissinger's triangulation. China regarded the Soviet Union as their primary external adversary up to that point. But after that, they decided to regard the United States as their primary adversary, but to keep that relatively close hold in the sense that they didn't want to poke us in the eye with it. They wanted to, in the dictum that's ascribed to Deng Xiaoping, to bide their time and hide their capabilities until they were strong enough economically, militarily, diplomatically to compete openly against the United States for primacy in the Indo-Pacific region and more broadly across the whole Eurasian continent and the rest of the world.
That's a really interesting period of time, because that seems like it's also the early 90s is really the period of time in which American academic institutions began engaging with China, and we saw Chinese grad students coming to the U.S., especially learning disciplines such as law. And there was this view during the 90s that also, I mean, it carried forward well beyond the 90s, but my take on it is that really the 90s is when this view coalesced or solidified, which is that through engagement, we can make China more like the U.S. or more like a liberal democracy. I mean, that's,
yeah, it's funny. You hear some revisionism now where people say, no, we never believed that it would actually have, changed China. But of course, that's not true. If you go back and read the historic record on all of the statements that were made, and by the way, I subscribed to a lot of those views myself back in the 1990s, right? I don't think that that it was a crazy idea to think, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, that China might end up going in a similar direction to converge with a more liberal order over time. It wasn't a crazy idea, but it was a wrong idea. It just turned out to be wrong. We don't need to cast aspersions about it. At least, for that decade of the 1990s, the historic record's extremely clear that American officials during the Clinton administration in particular, but continuing on into the Bush administration, believed that by making China rich, we would make it a more pluralistic and at a minimum friendlier to our interests and to the sort of liberal order that we'd constructed in the aftermath of World War II. Aaron Friedberg, a professor at Princeton, I just read a monograph of a book that he's written that's going to be coming out in 2022. It is the definitive history of that policy, the formulation, the assumptions that were made that underpinned that 30-year, really quarter of a century policy of engagement, what for shorthand we call engagement, but engagement carried with it all of these hopes and assumptions that by making China more powerful, we would make it friendlier to our interests. And we were dead wrong. The United States committed a pretty grievous blunder there, and we ended up creating a peer competitor that is now less friendly to our international interests than it was at the beginning of that whole process.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about what you've said is that when China's government opened up and started allowing elite students to go to the U.S. for graduate studies, and then loosened that up more, that the entire time, I mean, from your perspective, Chinese leadership was thinking, hey, the U.S. is an adversary. They think that we're opening up and trying to embrace them and learn from them and to become more like them. But in reality, we're trying to learn from the United States to be a stronger competitor or adversary. Is that an accurate way of, I guess, explaining, distilling your view?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's clear that the goals of the party, this isn't talking about the goals of individual Chinese citizens who have done amazing things. They've come to the United States. They've built new companies, created new technologies, contributed to advances in science, and contributed to really the collective prosperity of both countries. But the Chinese Communist Party is a different thing. It has goals that are quite zero sum in their estimation. They talk about the United States in ways that I think we either weren't aware of or we ignored, sometimes willfully, sometimes just through laziness, not translating what Chinese leaders were saying in their own language when they didn't think we were listening.
也绝不允许任何外来势力欺负、压迫、奴役我们。谁妄想这样干，必将在14多亿中国人民用血肉铸成的钢铁长城面前碰得头破血流。
But when you really piece together the compendium of the party's strategic aims, they've been quite hostile to the United States and to the U.S. order that we've been defending. And that fig leaf, to an extent, has now been dropped. That's the real difference between Xi Jinping and his predecessors, is not that the goals have changed so radically, the means have changed, but also the openness of their intention to create, in his words, a community of common destiny for mankind, and everything that entails, which very clearly, very deliberately, and openly, when you read the texts of what he's saying and what his key personnel are writing in sort of fleshing out his vision, it is a vision about changing global governance to be to really privilege authoritarianism. And so, it's hard to think of something that's more diametrically opposed to U.S. interests and the interests of other free and sovereign states. But that's where we are now. And that fig leaf is blown away. China talks very openly, very disparagingly of democracy now. In fact, it's trying in Orwellian fashion to redefine democracy, to say true democracy is totalitarian dictatorship, because only a totalitarian dictator can actually deliver what the people really need. And so you see this
sounds very much like 1984.
1984, an Animal Farm, and everything that Orwell was so insightful about in all of his writing. But that's where we are now. So you'll see U.S. democracy blasted quite openly, whether it was in that Alaska meeting, the first meeting between the Biden administration's top foreign policy officials and Chinese foreign policy officials, where they took advantage of being on camera to basically lecture the United States about how democracy, as we practice it, is a total failure, and only China's totalitarian dictatorship really can really deliver what the people need. So there's this open competition now between systems, and I think a lot of Americans didn't hope that there wouldn't be an ideological component to our competition, but China has ensured that it's highly ideological, and hence, and President Biden, to his credit, is picked up on that and is trying to rally democracies with his recent democracy summit, and in many of the speeches that he's given, he's talked about how democracy reached its high point in the world following the Cold War, and now it is ebbing, and authoritarianism is flowing. Democracy still presents the greatest hope for humanity, but we've got to actually fight for it now. We can't just assume that dictatorships are going to voluntarily give up their monopoly on power in order to actually allow a greater say in governance by their own people.
One question that has really nagged at me, and it's impossible to answer it definitively, but to what extent do you think the global financial crisis altered the trajectory of China's plans and its relationship with the West? Because, I imagine that at the very least, it's given China what it feels like is a more receptive global market to that dogma of prosperity through dictatorship. But I wonder if it reinforced views, or strengthened views within the CCP that democracy is inherently flawed.
Yeah, the 2008 crisis, I think it heightened this longstanding paradox that exists at the high levels in Beijing of, on the one hand, feeling deeply paranoid about their own people, and that the Chinese Communist Party goes to bed every night and wakes up every morning worrying primarily about its own people turning on them. Okay, that's their primary threat. It's their primary vulnerability, is that lack of democratic legitimacy. So I think the financial crisis heightened, on the one hand, that sense of paranoia that, my gosh, the economy is slowing. They flooded their economy with credit just to try to keep people in work and in jobs and so forth. But it also created that paradoxical sense of superciliousness or overconfidence that the West is somehow inevitably in decay and in decline. which is an old meme among authoritarian states. It goes back to the 19th. It goes back to the early or the late 18th century and our revolution, and that continued repeatedly over the course of our 2.5 centuries of history. That people have counted out the United States. They believed that this experiment with self-governance and separation of powers and constitutionalism, where everyone is subject to the law, no one's above the law. Monarchs and autocrats have believed repeatedly that that's a hopeless experiment and it's inevitably going to lead to decline. And we've seen that cycle repeat itself. 2008 whipped up that sort of hopefulness within the Communist Party that the United States would inevitably decline. And so that helped supercharge this sort of stripping away of the fig leaf of hide and bide, and to actually, as Hu Jintao late in his tenure said, now we're going to start to do some things. And of course, Xi Jinping picked up from where Hu left off and really slammed the pedal to the metal in trying to sprint towards consolidating, extending Chinese influence globally, but also consolidating more and more power into the hands of the state at home. So and there's no doubt that 2008 was something that really heightened that paradox of fear of their own people, the belief that they needed to take greater control over all aspects of Chinese society, but also gave them this sense of overconfidence that their historical rise was inevitable and that American historical decline was inevitable. I think they're going to be proven wrong on both fronts, by the way.
And I'd love to get to that and understand, really how. Because sometimes it does seem so, it seems so difficult for the U.S. at this moment in time to push back and compete because China has, we've had an open society and we've educated China as to how our society works, that CCP seems to understand our vulnerabilities and us arguably better than we do. And China's also co-opted a lot of our business and cultural elite. And to me, that's and I know that's something that retired General H.R. McMaster has talked a lot about, is just how China has been able to do that. But at what point do you think that was really the plan, or what point did that element become evident? And because from my perspective, and I'm largely an outsider here, but it seems like that's the key stumbling block here, where Hollywood will not depict China in negative ways. They seem to do it relentlessly positive ways. You've got cultural icons, from the NBA who refuse to criticize China. And obviously our business and academic elite as well seem to have been co-opted. So
yeah, well, you're right. There's no question that a lot of our business and academic and in some cases sports and entertainment elites have been co-opted, or at least beguiled by money, to the extent that they've been surrendering their values and the collective values of their countrymen in the United States. The good news is that if the United States were simply, we are still a rule of law society. Most of our companies are law abiding. The problem is that we haven't put guardrails in place that are sufficient to actually require business to do the right thing. When some of these businessmen say things like, well, look, if my government tells me that they're leveling the playing field for all American business, and that there's certain sectors of the Chinese economy that we're no longer going to be allowed to invest in, and that we should actually receive incentives to start diversifying our supply chains away from China for some of the critical things that the United States needs, whether it's medicine and syringes and protective equipment, or some of the critical materials inputs that are critical for our national defense, or battery technology. We could end up in the completely preposterous situation where we've just achieved energy independence in the United States and are no longer dependent on the Middle East, thanks to innovation that's allowed us to get at natural gas and so forth. And of course, now that we aspire to move on to solar energy and these renewables, Were we to make ourselves wholly dependent on China for the batteries, for example, or the solar panels and other inputs to that, we would basically be trading the Middle East for China as something that we're wholly dependent on for our energy security. So we just need to have more thoughtful political leadership in the United States, because if the rules are laid out in law, in executive order, and the like, to do the things that we need to do to make ourselves self-sufficient, or to reduce our dependency on China in some of those areas where our prosperity and national defense are dependent, or our energy independence are dependent, U.S. business will fall in line because they follow the law. They have huge compliance shops filled with lawyers that are all scared of violating U.S. law. It's just that we haven't laid down the law yet. And that's where Congress comes in. That's where we need to see, frankly, stronger leadership than we're seeing so far in the first year of the administration, to actually move towards laying down those strict rules. And the rules really follow in three areas. It's about capital flows, it's about technology flows, and it's about data and information flows. Those are the three areas that the United States needs to knuckle down, where China knows that it's in a competition, in its view, a zero-sum competition for supremacy, and where we're just sort of fumbling along laissez-faire, not recognizing that the starting gun, sounded, years ago, and we're kind of milling about the starting line again. And so it's all well and good to complain, as we should. We should be disgusted in some cases by what some of our financial and entertainment elite have said, or the ways that they've genuflected to a totalitarian genocidal dictatorship. But, at the end of the day, this is why we have a government. It's why we elect government. It's to do what the majority of American peoples know that we have to do, which is to start dealing much more aggressively and systematically and strategically on those technology flows to and from China, capital flows, and information and data flows.
You might not like the way that I characterize what you're saying, and it's an oversimplification, but it sounds like on some level, the solution to dealing with China is for us to become a little bit more like China and have more government direction of business and the economy.
Well, look, even at the height of the Reagan administration during the Cold War, you saw incentives, sticks and carrots offered by the U.S. government in some of those critical industries like semiconductors, for example, that were designed to prevent us from pursuing suicidal dependencies with our chief adversary. That didn't undo our system. It actually allowed us to bring the Cold War to a soft landing. So, if it's good enough for President Reagan to have some guidance on some of the critical industries like he had on semiconductors, it's good. It's certainly good enough for the Biden administration, which has not been shy about inserting the U.S. government into the heart of so many other aspects of our economy. Why not do a little of that in the strategically important sectors of technology that are going to really determine who writes the rules for the 21st century. And you can do that in a way that actually unleashes the private sector. You're not trying to bound the private sector. What you're trying to do is protect the private sector from a mercantilist, hostile, non-market player to say, look, we're gonna have to raise tariffs in some cases against some of these Chinese inputs. We might have to actually restrict U.S. investment in some of these key technologies in China, so that more of the investment focuses on free societies and helps free societies up their game and their competency in things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, or biotechnology and genetics, advanced materials and the like. And it's no coincidence that all of these have dual use capabilities, right? For every one of these technologies has both civilian commercial applications as well as military or domestic, in the case of China, domestic repression capabilities, like you're seeing with their advances in facial recognition technology, what they're doing to take the genetic sequences of all of their ethnic minorities and the like. We don't want them writing the rules about that stuff. We also don't want them to be advancing or leapfrogging past us in those technologies. We want to write the rules in ways that are ethical and that are in keeping with free societies, and not allowing China to basically achieve a monopoly in the 21st century over those technologies that in some ways are the equivalent of what nuclear energy was in the 20th century.
And look, I completely agree with you. The one thing though that does distress me when I think about comparing the present time to that of the Reagan administration is, and I think this exposes at this moment in time the fundamental disadvantage or a disadvantage that capitalist system, market system has vis-a-vis a dictatorship like China. And that is the technological superiority used to be vested in the government in the United States. I mean, the United States defense industry had, and the government itself had the most sophisticated technologies in the world. But what's happened as microprocessors have become consumer items, that technological edge has really devolved from the government to the private sector. And then you run into this conundrum where, under at least the present thinking with respect to capitalism, and there's some, thought to changing this to stakeholder capitalism, but really when you look at our legal system and the way that fiduciary duties are structured, duties are effectively to the company shareholders, and that is usually interpreted as meaning if I have the opportunity to sell this technology to China, I will. If I have the opportunity to sell my business to a subsidiary of Alibaba, I will. And you brought up the idea, or you brought up it's pretty obvious, the notion that the U.S. government needs to put in place some curbs, but the same executives who I think will say things like, hey, if the rules were changed, then we wouldn't do X, Y, Z. Their companies spend lots of money lobbying the government, the United States government, to keep the policy, keep the status quo, basically. And I feel like that's, and look, you've been inside DC, so maybe I'm overstating that case, but to me, that's the impression that I have, is that really, they'll say one thing publicly, but our, chieftains of commerce are pushing for status quo, and like PS, that increases the size of their bonuses too.
Yeah, sure. Well, and Madison wrote about this, and this is a risk in our system, right? That special interests will keep slicing away at what's in the national interest, and that's been a tension and a challenge for our system since its first days. And that's what takes strong leadership, and it takes leadership to overcome that. And I think that when the American people, who by and large know instinctively, when you lay out the facts for most Americans, they say, yeah, what are we doing? Why are we committing suicide by strengthening through technology transfer and capital investment our chief adversary in the world? The costs for American business, as well as for sports celebrities and others, is going to rise. And I already see the indications that the costs of continuing down that track are starting to cost them credibility and market share with the American public, which puts them into a new dilemma that they haven't faced previously. Before, they would just lobby Washington, D.C. in ways that aligned with Beijing's interests in the hope that they could gain access to the Chinese, that ephemeral Chinese market that hasn't actually really delivered for the great majority of U.S. industries, by the way. But what you see now are people starting to speak out. You saw the case, often in, sports has ended up being an area where our national conscience starts to express itself. And you saw that with both the Women's Tennis Association making their decision to withdraw all of their tournaments from China, in response to China's silencing and control over Peng Shuai, a Chinese tennis star. The Communist Party's actions there have led the WTA to stand up and say, well, look, this is not in keeping with the values of our players. It's not keeping in the values of our fans. And we can actually stand up and say no. It was kind of an amazing thing. China had nothing to say to that. There was nothing they could say about that. Or you look at Enes Kanter Freedom, the Boston Celtic. I grew up in Boston. I think he's a real hero. This guy is he's a new American. He just immigrated here. He just swore the oath last month to become an American. And he's basically choosing to forego corporate sponsorship so that he can speak up against authoritarian regimes around the world, including China. And he's calling out American companies that are enabling the Chinese repression of their ethnic minorities, or that are contributing to China's technological advances and to its military industrial complex. So increasingly, people are going to speak up. And they're starting to do so in ways that are going to put American companies on the horns of a dilemma. American companies are going to be like a sailor straddling two ships. China is one of those ships going this direction. The American people are going to start pulling the American ship back towards our fundamental values. And sailors are going to have to choose, or they're going to get very wet.
And talking about the co-option and also policy blind spots, one of the things that has frustrated me for a long time from the outside is that in the United States government didn't seem to understand the role that capital markets play in this competition between China and the US. And I've identified a few areas in which I think China is systematically abusing the U.S. and global capital markets. I mean, there's obviously the massive amount of fraud that's committed by China-based issuers on U.S. markets, but there's also some things that we've seen. China seems to have some very opaque ways or clever ways of providing state subsidies from state-owned banks to ostensibly privately owned companies that have shares publicly traded in Hong Kong in many cases, sometimes New York. When I spoke a few years ago to somebody who had been in this policy space before, I mean, he told me, he said, look, we in DC, we understand the trade issues, but capital markets just, the only people we talk to in capital markets world are people at the big banks and who, are large asset managers whose, vested interests are really to keep status quo. It seems like that changed, obviously. Senator Rubio seemed to be banging on that drum for a while. And obviously, President Trump and the Trump administration at the end, supported passage of the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. But what from your perspective, I guess, how much has DC improved its understanding of the capital markets role in this and what remains to be done here?
The bad news is, you're right. We've lost our competency, or we've failed to acquire competency in our government over things like semiconductors or supply chain management for strategically important materials, or as you put it, on the capital markets front. Quite frankly, our government is incompetent at these things. The good news is that we have, in previous competitions, during the Cold War, for example, we acquired the competencies that we needed. It took time. But for example, the US government has enormous depth of talent and capability on tracking nuclear energy, for example, or even just tracking the oil industry, right? Because we knew how critical both of those things were for our economy and for our national security during the 20th century. What our government it needs to build new institutions. It probably needs to dismantle other institutions at the same time, but to create and refresh new institutions within government that are designed to track capital flows, passive money, which the Treasury Department has no clue. Our Treasury Department does not understand the most basic things about the flow of capital through passive investment, for example, tied to indexes. The indices that the index providers have larded up with some of the worst companies in the world, Chinese A-share companies, which you know from your time when I was a reporter 20 years ago in China, and you spent time in China. You've made a living looking at fraudulent Chinese companies. The A-share companies are the most opaque, worst regulated, crappy state-owned enterprises in the world. And it turns out that American pension money is all flowing into those very same companies right now, unbeknownst to American pensioners. Even in some cases, unbeknownst to the big money managers that just sort of blindly peg their investments to the MSCI and other indices, which have unscrupulously, I would add, very dangerously, scandalously, in my view, been adding heavier amounts of Chinese companies to those indices. This is something that needs to be investigated by Congress as well as by independent panels. I was talking to a friend the other night who said that it took him a lot of work, but he was trying to figure out where his Vanguard fund is actually invested. And he found that 20% of it is in the People's Republic of China. He hit the roof. He had no idea. And he's one of the most financially savvy people I know. And so most Americans don't realize that we're shoveling hundreds of billions of dollars a year into Chinese stocks and bonds through our pension funds that are sometimes several steps removed from where that money actually, where the rubber meets the road in China. So we need to rebuild that kind of competency. And it's going to take congressional investigations. Subpoenas need to be issued to all of those index providers. They need to be called to the carpet and investigated for what were the reasons why they started adding Chinese companies so heavily at a time when Chinese investing has never been more opaque. Chinese journalists are being jailed, including financial and business news reporters are being jailed at the highest rate in history. Most foreign reporters have been kicked out. China has locked down what used to be publicly available data, very, very simple data at the State Administration of Industry and Commerce. All of the data is being locked down. All the reporters are being locked up at the same time that Western index providers are adding more and more companies from China. So this is a scandal. It goes beyond the 2008 sort of scandals that led to that financial crisis. I think Americans are going to get crushed. They're going to see their nest eggs get crushed because they're invested in some of the worst companies in the world, unbeknownst to them. So if you require the Treasury Department to actually start tracking those capital flows. Have those index providers having to be called to the carpet. In semiconductors, you need to build up, again, that kind of competency because it's such a critical technology. All of these highfalutin, fancy technologies we're talking about in the 21st century are built on the pillar of semiconductors, yet we've pretty much have very little competency within our government. It needs to be redundant, by the way. The Department of Energy, the Defense Department, Commerce and Treasury, as well as the intelligence community need to beef up their understanding and knowledge about these supply chains involving semiconductors. So we can rebuild. The good news is, imagine, Carson, if we were even slightly competent or paying attention to these things as a government, how much of an impact that could have in advancing our national security. We've been basically competing for 20 years with China without even focusing on the areas that are the centerpiece of the competition from China's perspective. So the good news is a little bit of competency is going to go a really long way in making us formidable again.